So, as I've been saying, what we're doing, we're trying to do in these reflections is to look at how the story of Holy Week, the Passion and the death of Jesus, which of course can only be understood in the light of the resurrection. There wouldn't be any record of his dying, of his death, or of his teaching, if it weren't for the light of the resurrection, which the early disciples, the early Christians experienced. Because they experienced this resurrection, they began to tell the story and to reflect more and more deeply and interactively, communally, through different cultures and different traditions and different perspectives on the story, on the teaching, and of the special significance of those last days. So, in a way, it's difficult to make any sense of the story as we read it without faith. Now, faith doesn't mean you have to believe every single word literally. Faith is not so much about belief as about an openness to the power, to the depth, to the meaning that is present in the relationship you have with this communication, but in which your faith, your belief may not yet have been shaped very much. But so faith is about openness rather than prejudging and thinking that you know it all, or thinking that what you heard as a child is what it really is about. So faith is about a relationship. We talk about faithful relationships. So we have to read and listen and act out this story in faith if we are to make any sense of it. So the early Christians were generating this faith from an experience that they called the resurrection. And the resurrection, we'll come to that later. But the resurrection is the starting point of the meaning of the story. So we've been looking at just how meaningful this story is of Holy Week, and how the way the story is told, what is not said, the details that linger in your mind, in your memory, and of course in the ancestral memory, in the archetypal memory, that this story, these details illuminate our own lives. They shed light upon ourselves, upon how we're living, how we're dying, how we face the dying and rising of every day, of the phases of our life. So this Holy Week is really a great flare of light that allows us to live this life in a different way if we are illuminated by it, if we allow ourselves to be open to it. So we've looked at a number of those major themes, and the theme I'd like to look at this morning is death. Tomorrow is Good Friday, and the death of Jesus. We venerate the cross. Tonight and Holy Thursday, we celebrate the Last Supper Jesus celebrated with his friends the day before he died. So let's just look at what a couple of the Gospel accounts say and how they describe the actual death of Jesus. This is Matthew. So Jesus is on the cross, the people are mocking him, and even the robbers, in Matthew's version, who are crucified on either side of him, are making fun of him in the same way. From midday, a darkness fell over the whole land, which lasted until 3 in the afternoon, which is why tomorrow we celebrate the liturgy of the Passion at 3 o'clock. In the morning we'll have the way of the cross around the lake, recalling the stages of Jesus' last walk. I remember thinking of it when I was in Delhi. Once I went to the house where Gandhi lived and where he was shot and killed at evening prayer one day. And in this is kind of a shrine now, of course, and there's a path marked with footsteps on the ground which he followed on that last walk he made from his room to the place where they were going to pray when he was shot. So that was his Via Dolorosa, that was his last walk. So in Jerusalem, a few weeks ago, I was with a group of pilgrims, and we got up very early in the morning because it would otherwise be very crowded, and we walked the Via Dolorosa, the last steps that Jesus took from the praetorium where he had been tried, and up to the site of the crucifixion. So, specifically, about midday, a darkness fell over the whole land, which lasted until 3 in the afternoon, and about 3, Jesus cried out aloud, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a verse from one of the Psalms, so it's often described as Jesus experiencing total despair, a sense of disconnection. But in the context, the psalm is about moving from despair into life, into hope again. So it is about despair, but despair experienced with hope. Some of the people standing by heard this, and they said, "He's calling on Elijah." It's a funny kind of detail. They hear him saying, "Eli, Eli," they think he's calling on Elijah. They misinterpret him. They misunderstand him, as they frequently did. Whenever he spoke, they often did not understand what he meant. One of them ran at once and fetched a sponge which he soaked in sour wine and held it to his lips on the end of a cane. So a small act of kindness to a dying man. And it's interesting that at this moment of his dying, if you've ever been with someone who's dying, sometimes they are very thirsty, and their lips are very dry, and so it's a small act of kindness to moisten their lips and give them, usually with a little sponge. So, moving moment of a small act of kindness. Father John was once asked, what is the best way to prepare for meditation? And he said, small acts of kindness. So small acts of kindness have great meaning if we perform them genuinely. But the others said, let us see if Elijah will come to save him. So beside the small act of kindness, which seems to redeem the cruelty of the moment, there's also this hard sadistic, cruel, mean, nasty side of humanity. So here is Jesus dying, a small act of kindness, but being mocked and humiliated by others. Jesus again gave a loud cry and breathed his last. So he died. Then let's look at the Gospel of John. So here, from John standing behind the camera, we see a different account of the same event, or different version, or different perspective on the same event. So Jesus is crucified. The soldiers, having crucified Jesus, took possession of his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier, leaving out the tunic. The tunic was seamless, woven in one piece throughout. So they said to one another, "We must not tear this, let us toss for it." And so the text of Scripture came true. They shared my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Interesting how John seems to focus in on very small details. Later in the description of the disciples going into the tomb, the empty tomb, he describes how the cloths were folded and neatly laid in the tomb. So a detail that must maybe part of the ancestral memory passed on in the oral tradition, but also seen by the gospel writers as the fulfillment of symbols, prophecies in other parts of the scripture. So Jesus was seen as fulfilling the biblical prophecies, but also, we could say, fulfilling the human intuition, the human aspiration for redemption, for the Messiah, for liberation. And so the soldiers casting lots so that who's going to get this cloak or this cloth, this tunic. And this is what the soldiers did. But meanwhile, near the cross, where Jesus was hanging on the cross, stood his mother with her sister, Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. So these 3 women, three Marys, the Trois Maries, standing at the foot of the cross. This became part of the great legend and the great myth of the Trois Maries, who then came to the south of France somewhere, I think in Provence. Every one of these details in the Passion narrative has become a legend, has generated huge literature and art interpretations. People read this much more than most people haven't read it today, but people read this with deep attention, reflected deeply upon every detail of it. It entered into their deep imagination and represented itself in art, in poetry, in music, of course. So in all this story, which we barely know in our culture, is one of the most fertile stories ever composed. Jesus saw his mother with the disciple whom he loved standing beside her. He said to her, "Mother, there is your son," and to the disciple, "There is your mother." And from that moment, the disciple took her into his home. So here, Mary, who was at the beginning of the story, in the birth in Bethlehem, is here at the end of the story beside the cross, silent in at both moments, but present. After that, Jesus, aware that everything had now come to its appointed end, said in fulfillment of Scripture, I thirst, I'm thirsty. So Jesus, conscious that this was the right moment, this was the fullness of time. And again, in our lives, shall we unplug the machine? So our approach to death has become medical rather than spiritual. And we find death very difficult to accept or to understand. We'll see in a moment. But in earlier cultures, death was seen as inevitable, something that needed to be accepted, something that could be prepared for, something that had meaning. And it was more of a communal event in traditional sort of societies in the Middle Ages in Europe. There's a study of it by Philip Arias. When people often had a sense, well, now's my time. I'm going to die now, so I don't want any more doctors bothering me. I'm going to die. The time has come. And they would take to their bed and wait. But the family would be with them. And as the time of death approached, and there was a kind of intuition or sense that the moment was dream-like, word would go around in the village, and people would come and stand in the room. So it would be just as you would for a birth. People would stand outside waiting for a baby to be born, so they would wait also for this moment of birth into the next life. And death was seen as meaningful and also humanly painful and tragic. This spiritual understanding of death didn't mean that it was not painful, but it meant that you could understand the pain in a different way and the suffering in a different way. So Jesus, aware that now was the time, says, I thirst. A jar stood there full of sour wine, so they soaked a sponge with the wine, same detail that we saw in Matthew, put it on a javelin, a spear, and held it to his lips. Having received the wine, he said, it is accomplished. Consummatum est. C'est fini, c'est accompli. So he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So, most spiritual traditions see death as a great teacher and a source of wisdom. In our culture, we see death as a medical failure or something that is merely tragic, merely awful, incomprehensible, and maybe meaningless, or maybe makes you think that life itself is meaningless if it ends like this. So, but traditional societies saw death as a teacher, as a way of receiving wisdom. In our John Main seminar this year, I'm not quite sure how we're going to do it, but it's scheduled for October in Mexico. The theme is indigenous wisdom, the wisdom of the indigenous peoples, native peoples, particularly of Latin America, but other indigenous peoples, for our time. And there's a growing sense, and maybe through this pandemic and the way it has forced us to examine ourselves socially, culturally, maybe through this pandemic we will become more attuned to the wisdom of those indigenous cultures and what they have to teach us today. I was talking to one of the speakers, the main speaker at that seminar in October, and he told me that he had a conversation with a young man, family man, from a village in northern Mexico, southern Mexico. And this young man had come out of his village life, and he'd come to the city, and he'd done well, been educated, had good opportunities for jobs. But he said he was going to go back to his village. And the priest asked him, why are you going back? You could really have a good life here, you could do well for yourself in the city. And the young man said, well, he said, I've seen life here in the city, and I can see that what is happening here is not going to last. That the kind of life that you're living here is not sustainable, and it is causing great misery, and it will collapse. So he said, I'm going to go back to my village, because one day you will come to us there and ask for help. And I want to be able to be there and to share with you what we know, the wisdom that we have in our culture, although it doesn't have Wi-Fi and it doesn't have credit cards and doesn't have all the things that modern techno culture has. We have something that you will find necessary one day. So most spiritual traditions have this understanding of death as a teacher of wisdom, and they often have practices of what we call memento mori, remembering death. Keeping death always before your eyes is what St. Benedict says. One of the tools of good works, or the skillful means, is to keep death always before your eyes. Now for us, that sounds a bit morbid or gruesome, to be thinking of death all the time. No, we should be living, we should be enjoying ourselves. But the purpose of this memento mori, remembering death, is not to be morbid, not to be death-obsessed, but quite the reverse. It is to be able to taste life and live fully. And when you look at one evening of television, and you'll see how our culture deals with death and life. So life is presented, a good life, fun life, is presented in terms of youth and beauty and happiness and the fulfillment of desires. You see that in the ads, in commercials, in most of the soap operas and so on. But running through that, and very obvious in the TV series, in the television programs, the fiction, is this obsession with death. There's no American film or TV series that doesn't have a gun in it. And the gun usually becomes the main driving force of the plot. Whoever holds the gun has the power. And more in TV shows, the graphic depiction of violence is just, it's more and more perverse. And this obsession with showing death and and killing and torturing, and especially against women and so on. So we have a very strange attitude towards life and death. If you were to spend one evening watching most of the American TV, that's what you would find, and it hardly expresses mental health. You would say if you had spent a night dreaming like that, you would feel that you probably needed to talk to somebody the next day. So this idea of memento mori is not about morbidity at all. We are morbid about death because of our repression of death and our fear of death. When my father was dying, I was called, I was in Canada at the time, and I was called there, but I wasn't given much information about his state. I didn't realize until I got there how close he was to death. And I stayed with him until he died, some hours later. But nobody, the family who were there, or the doctors, nobody, this wasn't that long ago, about 20 years ago, nobody would even admit he was dying. So I said to the doctor, what is his condition? He said, well, we'll have to see, it just didn't want to say, your father, has a very short time to live. And yet, in the wisdom traditions, death is a great teacher. In the Katha Upanishad, Yama, the god of death, is a great teacher of humanity. And this young boy, Nachiketas, who's searching for meaning, truth, and wisdom, penetrates into the kingdom of death and questions death, forces death to reveal its secrets. Plato says that philosophy is about nothing else but dying and being dead. And even in the Roman world, the ancient Roman world, when a Roman general came back from victorious campaigns and would enter into Rome with a triumph, and he would be in his chariot, and the crowds would be there, and all the slaves and captives that he had accumulated were in front of him, waiting to be executed. So he was in this moment of glory, of triumph. But there was a slave, well, this is a story anyway, but some people say, there was a slave sitting in the carriage, out of sight, who kept on saying to him, just think of your own death, you're only a man. So in the ancient world, even at the moment of great fulfillment and success, you were expected to remember that you were mortal. In the 15th century in Europe, a very popular couple of books, I think, were published called the Ars Moriendi, the Art of Dying. And it gave advice on protocols for a good death, how to prepare for death, how to arrange the circumstances, and so on. Very foreign to our idea of dying, which is basically about, except with the palliative care movement and this more spiritual understanding of medicine as preparing us for a health that is more than just survival. But generally, this idea of preparing for death is very foreign to our culture. And it probably grew up in the 14th century because they also had their epidemic. They had the plague, the Black Death, which killed a huge portion of the population, not just once, but came back in different waves. And people, villages, whole villages and families, of course, everybody was affected by it. What we're experiencing today is probably, certainly can be compared with that. So out of this experience of the plague, they thought seriously about how to prepare for death. And they had a number of steps. I'll just run through them. First of all, it was to explain that dying has a good side to it. You can explain this to the dying person. So you might like to think about what would be the good side of dying. Is there a good side to it? Well, for them, there was. For those with a spiritual path in life, death is not something to encourage or to anticipate, but it is inevitable. And we can see a meaning in it. Second step in preparing for a good death was they called the 5 temptations, to identify what goes through the mind and the feelings of the dying person. A lack of faith is the first one. So you may have, this happens to people who have been quite religious in their life. Sometimes as they approach death, their faith becomes very uncertain. Despair, feeling of hopelessness. Impatience, pride or greed. These were seen as 5 of the temptations or the states of mind that you would try to help the dying person to deal with and go through. And then there were 7 questions that you ask of the dying person so that they are involved in the preparation for their own dying, and not just passive, that they're being asked questions. Then the imitation of the life of Christ. So in a Christian culture, as we've just done, we look at the life of Christ, or the dying or the death of Christ, and we see a reflection in that description of what we are going through and of how we could go through it ourselves. And then the 5th step of this Ars Moriendi, art of dying, was addressed to the friends and to the family of the people standing around, waiting, looking after the dying person, and with advice to them on how to behave. Certain rituals, very important when death happens, to be able to have rituals to rely on. And in our culture, again, where we've lost ritual, we've lost the symbolic life, people often feel very helpless and very empty, because there's no way of expressing one's feelings, or what cannot be put into words. You can't put the experience of death into words. You have to, but there are rituals and symbols, which is what we're going to be doing in these next 3 days. Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. We're not theologizing or philosophizing or just arguing about the meaning of these stories, these events, but we are ritualizing them. It's a sacred theatre, a sacred drama, because the symbols are more expressive and more healing for us than words or ideas. And then finally, the sixth step in preparing the art of dying was for the prayers for the dying person to be recited. So this medieval text, which reflected medieval Christian approach to dying as a spiritual event, is reflected in the Buddhist tradition, a very famous text in the West, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, which means the liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. So in other words, the Bardo realms are these states of consciousness, or these realms of existence, which are intermediate between dying and your rebirth, the next step. And the dying person who is moving into these realms is spoken to. And just in the same way, perhaps, that when a monk is dying, another monk will sit beside him and read the Gospel of John. I did this for Father Bede, Griffiths, when he was dying. And he very deeply, and to Father John. I remember with Father Bede how painful it was for him to listen to these passages from St. John's Gospel, because they were so true, so powerful for him. He said, I can't take any more for the moment, just let me think about this. So in the Tibetan classic text here, you help accompany and prepare the dying person by speaking to them so that they can listen, and listening to a voice from this side of life as they enter into the next stage. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead also explains signs of death and the rituals that need to be performed, and the different stages of consciousness that you pass through, the moment of death in which you see the clear light of reality, as much as you can see it, as much as you've been prepared to see it, as much as depending on your spiritual capacity. But seeing, I suppose, with some degree of clarity, this pure light. And then they describe the visions that can come to the dying person, the visions of the Buddhas or other holy beings, very common in people who describe their dying process. And also the hallucinations that come, generated by your own karma, by your own memories, by your own unresolved issues or your own traumas. All of this will generate dream-like experiences. And in this accompaniment of the dying, we see that the importance of being able to recognize these productions of the mind, these constructions of the mind, as mentally generated. In other words, this is not reality. It's like a dream. When you're in the dream, it's real. When you wake up, you say, oh, that was a terrible dream. So the important thing in this text is to be able to recognize that these images, memories, or feelings are generated by your own mind. And once you've recognized that and let it go, you can move to the next stage until only reality is left. And if you go all the way, if you can let go of all of those attachments to all of those images, however powerful, however delightful they may be, or however terrifying they may be, you keep letting them go, you will eventually get there. You will eventually get beyond rebirth. And this is what we do in meditation. As the mind produces endless series of images and feelings, thoughts, attachments, things from the past, things we're fantasizing about in the future, we simply have to lay them aside. This is what the early monks called prayer, is the laying aside of thoughts. We do this with the simple fidelity to the mantra. We don't fight the thoughts, we don't engage them in dialogue during the time of meditation, but we just lay them aside, one after the other. This is not real, this is not real, this is not real. And returning to the mantra purifies the mind and brings us into this clear light of reality, light of the Holy Spirit. So there are many texts in many wisdom traditions. We have Dante's The Divine Comedy, for example, which also describes stages that we pass through from the inferno, hell, which is the experience of endless suffering, to the purgatorio, where there is still suffering, but you now can see that it is purifying, it is temporary. And then paradiso, where you enter into heaven, into the pure light. So the wisdom traditions all present death to us as a spiritual teaching, as an inevitable part of the human journey, as something that is meaningful, and something that we can learn how to handle with the help of others. We don't die well alone. And even Jesus here, it's a pretty terrible death, but we see he's not completely alone. So, the early Christians spoke about the importance of preparing for a holy death. And what we see in Jesus' death is a holy death. Why is it holy? It's holy because he has accepted it fully. And if you remember the film Interstellar, it was a great film, I thought, except for one terrible element in it, which ruined it for me, which was this character played by Michael Caine, who's this scientist who keeps on repeating these lines of Dylan Thomas, the Welsh modern poet who died. Do not go silently. Do not go gently into that dark night. Rage against the fading of the light. And it gets so boring after a while, just to hear that he keeps on repeating it, and it's sort of it's so immature, spiritually immature. to just see death as something you can't do anything about, so you just rage at it and shout and scream and kick, and this is all you can do. So a holy death, by contrast, is a death that you accept and learn from and see to be part of the journey of light. And meditation is our great preparation for that. It's about dying or letting go of oneself, dying to illusion as we let go of our thoughts. We no longer replaying the old movies, the remakes of the past, repeating the patterns of the past. And we break those repetitions of the patterns of the past by the faithful repetition of the mantra. And this liberates us then into something new. It's the funny thing. Sitting in meditation, repeating your mantra, doing it every day, that repetition is a renewal of our life and of our mind. Because it takes us through that great letting go. It's an experience of dying, letting go of oneself, but we are born into something new. And God is always younger than we are, according to the mystical tradition. So having a contemplative path, a contemplative practice, is essential, I would think, today, especially in the absence of a religious culture, which gives us these symbols and these rituals and this underlying faith community. Most people don't have that. So it's essential that we have a contemplative practice built into our daily lives that will allow us to prepare for death and to die well when the time comes, and to prepare for our final death, because we die many times, but for our final death, our last breath, to prepare for that without fear. And that's what I think we find by deep reflection on the death of Jesus, is the insight into the nature of death, something that is terrible, but also a great teacher of wisdom, and something that we ultimately do not have to fear.